Okay, in this session, we're going to create the enemy ships. One ship will just follow you, try to run into you and make you explode, while the other ship will try to shoot you. Additionally, we'll have the ability for our ships to take damage and explode, and when the ships get destroyed, we'll create this little particle system. So we'll dive into some code, we'll go into Unity's particle system, and more. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is change this blue background that's kind of like the standard for Unity backgrounds into something that's more space-like, deep space. So I'm going to click the main camera, and if we click this, we can simply change the value to be darker, and I'm also going to make this a bit more purple. So you guys can choose whatever you like. I'm going to go with a deep purple. So next, let's create some enemy ships, and the way I'm going to do that is by duplicating my player ship. So if I select my player ship, I do Control D once. I'm going to rename this to enemy ship. And then if I drag the X on the position, I can move one out to the left. Maybe -6 is a good spot. And this, we're going to have two different types of ships. One that will just simply try to run into you, and we'll call that a rammer, because I can't think of a better name. And then we'll create one more. And I'm going to put this on a +6 on the X position, and call this one a shooter. So maybe the rammer is faster, but it doesn't have the ability to shoot. Whereas the shooter, maybe it's slower, it's more of a tank, but it does have the ability to shoot the player. Additionally, let's give these some different colors so we can distinguish which is which. Maybe the rammer is more of a magenta color. So if I click the enemy ship rammer, go to sprite render, click the color tab, I can change the value of my color here. You guys can choose whatever you'd like, but I'm going to go with a magenta for the rammer, and for the shooter, just a plain red. Okay, next, we want to take off the player ship component because these are not the ships that we'll control. If you leave it on, you can do something kind of fun like this, where you can control several ships at one time. They're all going to follow the mouse, which is kind of fun to play with. Maybe you could create a game based off that mechanic. But for now, we're going to remove the player ship component from the enemy ship. So if you click one of these and then do Control or Shift click the next, you can select both of them and then remove the player ship component. Okay, so let's get these enemy ships at least following the player for now, and then we'll give them some more logic as we continue with the tutorial. So first, like for every object in our game, we need a class or a script for that. So let's navigate to our code folder here. Let's right click in some empty space, create C# script, and we will call this new class enemy ship. And remember, you never want a space in your naming for your classes. Always use camel casing. So every new word has a capital letter and there's no spaces. Okay, so now we have our enemy ship class. Let's double click that. And just like our player ship, we want to inherit from the ship class so that we can get all of its variables and access to all of its methods, like the ability to thrust and the ability to shoot a projectile. So from enemy ship, instead of inheriting from model behavior, we will inherit from ship. And ship inherits from model behavior. So we're kind of following the whole chain. Ship is a Unity object or a model behavior, and an enemy ship is a ship. Okay, so if you think about what an enemy ship has and what it does, an enemy ship has a target that it always is trying to follow and attack in our case. So the first variable that we want is a transform target. And this is of type transform because we simply care about the position that we need to follow. We don't really care about the ship component itself. We just need a position to follow, and we're going to call that target. Okay, so if you think about what does an enemy ship do that's unique, what kind of behavior does it have? An enemy ship flies towards the player. So we can create a method for that. Let's type void fly toward player. And we know we always want to do that. So in our update loop, we can simply type fly towards player so that every frame during the game is running, our enemy ship is flying towards the player. Okay, if you remember what our start method does, a start method is a reserved method within Unity, and it will execute whatever code is between these two brackets as soon as you hit play. So if you think about what the enemy ship needs to do, as soon as you hit play, the enemy ship needs to find the player right away so it knows what to follow. So let's make that happen. And we can do that by saying target, which is referenced here, is equal to find object of type. Make sure it says object of type and not objects, plural, of type. And then we simply want to find whatever object has the player ship component attached to it. And once we have that player ship, all we need is its transform. Remember, we just care about where it's positioned and not exactly what it is. So now we've assigned a value to our target, and now we can actually fly towards it. So first we need to declare a vector2. Remember, a vector2 is simply a variable that holds two values, usually an x and a y. And we'll call this direction to face. And this will be equal to a new vector2. Okay, so we've declared a vector2 called direction to face, and we're simply subtracting our target's position minus our own position. So if you can imagine where our target is and where our enemy ship is, this is essentially drawing a line between one point to the other. And we're declaring that up is that direction, or that line that we've just created. And then we're simply calling the thrust method, which we've already completed in our ship class. So that should just work. And now we can go back to Unity, make sure you Control S, go back to Unity, and let's add our enemy ship component to our enemy ships. So let's select both of them. We'll go to Add Component in the inspector. We'll find enemy ship, and then let's do these one at a time instead of selecting them both. That way each can have their own assigned rigid body, for example. You wouldn't want the rigid body of rammer to be in the rigid body reference in the shooter. So we need to do these individually. So for rammer, let's fill in the rigid body. Let's give it a projectile prefab in our prefabs folder. Let's give it our projectile spawn point, which is a child of the object in the hierarchy. Let's give it an acceleration of, let's see what our player ship is, 4 and 9. Let's do the same. So 4, 9, and then let's give it a projectile speed that's half of our players, so we'll do 500. Even though the rammer doesn't shoot, we'll keep that as is. Okay, and let's do the same for the shooter. Enemy ship, let's fill in all the missing pieces. Maybe the shooter's a little bit slower, so we could do 3 and 7, and then projectile speed of 500. And let's see if the enemy ships now follow the player. Okay, they do. And they're a little bit fast. Okay, but now nothing really happens when they collide with me, or if I shoot them, they just go right through. So we're going to give the projectiles the ability to collide with ships, and also give the ships the ability to take damage, and once they take enough damage, they'll explode. Okay, I think our ships are a little bit too fast. I'm going to bring down the speed and acceleration for both. So maybe this has an acceleration of 3 and 6, and the shooter, has an acceleration of 2 and 4. That'll make it a little bit easier for us to test out our game going forward. But next, let's create the ability for ships to take damage from the projectiles. So if we go to code, let's go to the ship class. We have these take damage and explode methods with nothing in them. So let's fill in these methods so they actually do something. Okay, so for take damage, we're going to make this a unique method such that we can pass in an amount for the ship to take damage. For example, we could have projectiles that do 1 damage or 10 damage, and this method could handle both of those different types of projectiles. So let's type in int and damage to give. And this will allow whatever method's calling take damage to pass in an amount of damage to give. Like we were mentioning earlier, we could either pass in do 1 damage to the ship, or 10, or anywhere in between, or more or less. Up to you. But to make this work, let's say current armor minus equals damage to give. Oops, that says damage to game. Don't know why I typed that. But yeah, let's make this damage to give. So this will simply subtract whatever the damage to give is from our current armor. So if our current armor is 5 and damage to give is 1, now current armor will be 4. Let's make a new line and we'll say if current armor is less than or equal to 0, then we know we have no more armor and we should explode and go boom. Okay, so if we hit a health of 0 or less, we will explode. However, explode does nothing right now. So let's, for now, simply make our ship destroy by typing in destroy, and we'll just pass in game object so that it will destroy the whole object. Okay, I think this is good for now. So now we need to make something called take damage. And we're going to create a projectile script to call take damage every time it hits a ship. So make sure you do Control S. Let's navigate back to Unity. And we are going to do create C# script and make a new class called projectile. Let's open up projectile. And first, let's give this a variable of type integer called damage to give. That way, if we expand on our game and we decide that different projectiles have a different amount of damage to give, we can change that at any time, as opposed to just hard coding every projectile does 1 damage. Cool. Additionally, we want to keep track of which ship is firing the projectile. The reason for that is because when your projectile gets instantiated or when you create it, it might collide with your current ship that's shooting it, and we don't want it to do damage to that ship. We only want it to do damage to the other ships. So we need to keep a reference of that. So we can type game object, and we'll call this firing ship. And this will be the ship that fires the projectile. Okay, so we don't need the start or the update methods for this class. And instead, we're going to create 2 methods. The first one will type void on trigger enter 2D. You'll see that once you start typing on trigger, we need on trigger enter 2D. And this method will call whenever it hits another trigger or collider. And in this case, we want to check to see if we're colliding with a ship, then we need to do damage to that ship. So the way we do that is with an if statement. Okay, so here we're saying if the thing that we're colliding with is a ship, and also the thing that we're colliding with isn't the ship that's firing the projectile, then we know we need to do damage to it. So with that information, we can get the ship component and apply the take damage method to it. And then we'll pass in damage to give, which is referenced here. Once we do that, we're going to destroy the projectile. That way, as soon as the projectile hits the ship, it won't just continue going forward or through it. It'll just destroy right there. So additionally, we need to assign this value of firing ship. So we're going to create a public method called getFired. And here we're going to be able to pass in the firer. I don't know if that's a real word, but that's what we're going to call the firing ship. Let's do that. No, we'll call it firer. And we'll say firing ship is equal to firer. Okay, so now we need to actually call this method. Let's go back to our ship class, and inside of fire projectile, right before we destroy the projectile, we're going to say projectile.getComponent, and we're going to get the projectile component. .getFired, and we're going to pass in our ship. That way, the projectile knows that this is the ship that's firing it. Please don't do damage to it. And that way, we're safe. Okay, so a few more things in our code we need to do before we go back to Unity. Let's go up to the top of our class, and What I want to do is make these, I want to hide these in the inspector so you can't change them at runtime. We only want to be able to change these variables here, but we want to hide these because these should be set in our code. So before these variables, we can type in the prefix hide in inspector, and that way we can't see them inside of Unity. And that way we won't get confused about which variables we can and should change versus which ones we should not. And next we need to assign our current armor to whatever our max armor is during the start of our game. So we can set our max armor to say something like 5, and then as soon as we press play, our current armor is set to 5. The reason we do this is because if we ever get a health power up or something like that, we can set our current armor back to our max armor. So let's set our current armor to the value of max armor in the awake method. So we're going to type a new method called awake. So this is just like the start method, but it will run one frame before the start. So it's, if you need to initialize anything before start, you can do so here. So we can type current armor equals max armor, and we should be good. So let's save that. Let's go back to Unity. And let's find our projectile inside of our prefabs folder, and we need to assign the projectile component to the projectile prefab. That way the objects can talk with each other. So let's set our max armor for all of our ships to 3. That way it should take 3 shots from our projectile that does 1 damage to destroy the ship. And also you'll notice that the current speed and current armor are no longer visible. That is good. Let's press play, and the projectile should take 3 shots to destroy each enemy. Nope. And the reason is because we did not give our projectile a damage to give. So right now, every time the projectile hits the ship, it's destroying, but it's not giving any damage. So let's change that damage to give to 1. We'll press play. One, two, three, and boom, we are good. So now we can shoot the enemy ships, but they cannot shoot us. So let's give the enemy ships the ability to fire projectiles at our ship. And we'll do that by going to code. Let's go to enemy ship. And we're going to declare a variable of type bool or boolean, which is a true false value, called can fire at player. Cool. And then we can either set this to true or false in the inspector. So if the ship is a rammer, we'll set it to false. And if it's a shooter, we can set this to true. And based on whether that's true or not, we can fire at the player. And we'll do that in our update loop. So we can say if can fire at player, then fire projectile. Cool. Let's save that. Control S. We'll go back to Unity. Let's navigate to the shooter object. And you'll see now we have a little checkbox. And let's select that to make it true. And let's see if the shooter then shoots the player ship. It sure does. Boy, does it. So it is shooting infinitely, which looks pretty cool, but maybe we don't want that. Remember, in our ship class, we declared a variable called fire rate. So let's use that fire rate variable so that the enemy ship can only shoot every few seconds. We want to create this functionality in the ship class because we might also want our player ship to have a fire rate as well. Right now we can just click the mouse as fast as we want and it will shoot, but maybe later we want to establish a fire rate. So let's go to the ship class, and right after fire projectile, we're going to create a new method, and this will be a method called a coroutine. So the way we do that is we type private IEnumerator, and we're going to call this fire rate buffer. So we can use this IEnumerator or coroutine to delay code. So what we'll do here is we'll make a variable called can shoot, and we'll set that equal to false, and then we'll wait for a few seconds, and then once that amount of time has passed, we'll set it back to true. So we can type yield return new, wait for seconds, and then we'll pass in our fire rate. So if we make fire rate 2, it will wait for 2 seconds. And then after that, we'll set can shoot back to true. Okay, and you'll notice can shoot, it's giving us those red squigglies saying, hey, you did something wrong. And that's because we did not declare a variable called can shoot. So we're going to go back up here. We're going to make another hidden variable. And we're going to make this of type public bool, which is a true false value. And we'll call this can shoot, just like we named it below. So can shoot is being referenced here. And if you have the spelling correct, you should have no more red squigglies. So lastly, we need to call this method. And we're going to call it every time we fire a projectile. It's going to go through this coroutine, and it's going to set it to false and then back to true. And we'll do that right after destroy. We'll say start coroutine, and then we'll pass in the name of our coroutine method. Okay, one more thing we need to do before we continue. Let's navigate back to enemy ship, and we're going to say if the enemy ship can fire at the player and our fire rate has expelled its time, or in other words, can shoot, then we can fire our projectile. So now we have the ability to fire at the player, and our fire rate should be working. So let's save that. If you want to be safe, you can hit the double save icon to save all. We'll go back to Unity, and let's see if the red ship and the shooter ship only shoots every few seconds. So let's establish a fire rate. Let's go to enemy ship shooter, and let's set a fire rate of 1. So it should shoot every second. Let's click play. Nope. So what did we do wrong? We have a fire rate of 1. We never set the can shoot to true. So let's do that from the get-go. We need to set can shoot is equal to true. Otherwise, can shoot is always going to be false. So by default, every Boolean that you declare is going to start as a false value. And if you want that to start as true, you need to tell it so. So we'll set it to true in the awake method. And let's go back to Unity. Okay, that looks much better. So it shoots every second. And we can also destroy those ships. Okay, so now all of our ship types can take damage. Our projectiles work. But when our ships get destroyed, it's pretty boring. You don't see anything, they just disappear. So next we're going to create a particle system to take the place of the disappearing ships to add something a little bit more exciting. So the way we do that, and we'll take a little break from code this way, we're going to right click in some empty space here, and we're going to create the parent for explosion object. So let's create a new game object. We'll reset this so that it's a position of 0, 0, 0, and we'll call this explosion. And also we're going to add an audio source to this because later on when we add sound effects, we're going to have this particle system or this object create a boom sound every time it gets instantiated. Next, let's right click explosion, and we're going to go down to effects and click particle system. So right now we've got just a very basic generic particle system that's shooting out little white semi-transparent balls. We're going to change that to make it look like a kind of a retro explosion. So if you want, you can follow me and do the same variables that I set in my particle system. Else, if you'd like to play around with the particle system, there's lots you can do with it. Either way works. So I'm going to first start here. I'm going to change this to 2. I'm going to take off looping because we just want it to happen once. And it's actually better to do this in your scene view because you can play it, stop it, restart it, and you can just have a better experience editing your particle system. So start lifetime 1, start speed 20, let's make them shoot out faster. And here we can change this to be a range between two constants. So it's going to be of size 0.3 to 0.7. And that's all I want to do here. So we've got tons of different fields that we can edit. Next we're going to do emission. And we're going to change this to 0. And instead make this of type burst. We're going to give this a burst. And we're going to change this to 80. And we're good here. So now it's just one big burst as opposed to just continuously playing. It's already looking a lot better. Okay, next let's go to shape. Instead of a cone, we're going to make this a sphere. So it'll go out in every direction. Okay, next we're going to go to limit velocity over lifetime. Let's change this to 100. And we're also going to dampen this so that it slows down. Additionally, we're going to give it some drag so that it slows down even more. So it starts off fast and then it slows down. It's looking a lot better. Okay, next we're going to check on inherit velocity. And we want to do this because if our ship is moving towards the left, we want the particle system to also inherit that ship's velocity so that the particle system also is going to the left even after the ship has exploded. It'll just look a lot more realistic. And we can save these, we can keep these as is. We just need to check this on. Next, let's check on color over lifetime. And instead of white, and this is pretty cool, you can make this a gradient scale. So you can have it start off as something like red. So if I click this tab, I choose red, and then I click this tab, and I choose orange. I have a little bit of a blend over time. So now if I click play, you'll see they start off red and they go orange. So actually I think it's going to look better if it starts yellow and goes to red. So, and also you can delete and add tabs. If you just click anywhere or click delete, you can add and remove. And I'm going to change this red to yellow. I think that's going to look a little bit better. Maybe a little bit darker on the yellow. Okay, I'm starting to like how that looks, so I'll keep that as is. Okay, so next we're going to go to size over lifetime. So we need to check this on, and right now it's getting bigger as it exists, but we want it to start off big, each particle to start big, and then end up small. So let's change this to, if you click this little bar right here, you can change this to any of these bar graphs down here. And I want it to get smaller over time, so I'm going to do this one right here. And you guys can test these out as you see fit. Okay, lastly, we're going to go to renderer, and right now it's just using the default particle system, which gives it that little sphere. I think that looks a little bit too generic. So instead, I'm going to choose just the sprite's default to make it a square instead of a little circle, just because I think it looks cooler. But you guys are welcome to choose whatever you'd like. I'm going to save it like that. And now we have our particle system. Okay, so now that we have our explosion object, we are going to instantiate a new copy of this explosion every time a ship gets destroyed. So we're going to make a prefab out of that, but we're going to be extra smart about this. We're going to create an asset folder called resources. So let's go to our assets folder, make a new folder. We'll call this resources. And this is a special folder because we can call this from our code and say, hey, give me something from this folder and put it into my game. So let's go ahead and drag our explosion object into our resources folder. It's going to create a prefab of the explosion. You'll see that it highlights blue here. So we can go ahead and delete this. And then if we go back to our code folder, let's go to our ship class. Let's scroll all the way down to explode. And before we destroy the game object, let's instantiate our new explosion prefab. So we can do that by saying instantiate. And then here we're going to use our resources folder. So if you start typing in resources.load, and then you can pass in the name of your prefab. And this part you need to be careful. We need to spell it exactly how we spelled it in our resources folder. So for me, it was just explosions with a capital E. Sorry, explosion. And then we need to pass in a position and a rotation for the object to be instantiated with. Okay, let's save that. Let's navigate back to Unity. And let's give it a shot. Okay, so it's working. It looks just like how we created it. It's also inheriting the velocity of the ship after it gets exploded. So things are looking good.